Hili Hili, no Hoyo Wishnim Amber. Hello everyone, my name is Amber Esquivel. I am the Outreach Counselor at Fresno State for the Native American Initiative. And I also come from the Picayune Rancheria of Chukchansi Indians. And I've been invited today to provide our land acknowledgement. So our land acknowledgement at Fresno State is the Fresno State campus sits in the midst of the San Joaquin Valley, a valley rich in the traditions and representation of Native American peoples and cultures. We are grateful to be in the traditional homelands of the Yokuts and Mono peoples, whose diverse tribal communities share stewardship over this land. And if you're not familiar with land acknowledgements, there is a link in the chat that you can go to visit, to download a PDF, to learn about what is a land acknowledgement, why do we use them, how to create your own. And they also have beautiful Zoom backgrounds, just like the one I'm using. And our land acknowledgement at Fresno State was created by our Director of American Indian Studies, Dr. Lisa Oliver. And I'd like to go to the next slide, as I was wanting to show you more of what I'm talking about in the land acknowledgement. Where are we talking about? So on the left of the page, you can see an image of California for the federally recognized tribes in our state. And on the right is a zoomed in picture of the Central Valley. So you can see these are our tribes within our area. And again, I'm saying federally recognized because we have unfederally recognized tribes in our area as well, including the Choinumni, the Wuchumni, the Dunlap Band of Mono Indians, our Chowchilla tribe of Yokuts. And Yokuts and Mono, these are terms that identify an area of where Native people reside. They are not a single tribe. So Yokuts is like myself, Picayune, Table Mountain, Santa Rosa, Tule River. Mono is North Fork, Big Sandy, Cold Springs, Dunlap. And those terms, again, are just identifying an area of where our Native people come from. So but these are the tribes that are in our state that come from those areas. And currently what's going on in our community right now in the Native community, if you haven't heard, there is a petition going around for a name change of Squaw Valley that resides in Fresno County. And I wanted to use this to not just share what our land acknowledgement is, but to also share what is currently going on in our community and how you can help us. And I will put in the chat the Facebook page where the petition is on there. There's an email if you would like to send an email to also offer your hand in support of our name change for Squaw Valley. And as well, for all of our listeners who are joining us, who are on our Zoom link or Facebook Live, I welcome you to use the chat box to also indicate which Native land you are also occupying. Thank you, Dr. Patricia Lopez, for inviting me. I thank you guys for providing this space and time for me to provide the land acknowledgement and also share a little bit about our Native people in the Central Valley.
Thank you, Amber. I appreciate that land acknowledgement and for raising awareness about the histories that are often suppressed or forgotten. These practices are also expressions of anti-racism and anti-racist epistemology. So I thank you for joining us. And to all of you, good afternoon. Again, I want to thank you for joining us today for the first of a three-part teach-in series focused on anti-racism. My name is Patricia Lopez, and I'm an assistant professor in the Kremen School of Education and Human Development here at Fresno State. I'm also the director of Enseñamos en el Valle Central, which has the honor of sponsoring these ongoing anti-racism series. In addition to our panelists, I want to call in my colleague and friend, Dr. Earl Aguilera, who's joining me today. We'd actually like to open our teach-in by asking each of you to join us in a moment of silence as we honor the lives of those who were violently murdered in the recent Atlanta massacre, and acknowledge that these events are part of an ongoing history of violence against Asian women. So Earl, would you please lead us in saying their name?
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. In this moment, we want to hold space and recognize the life lived and taken from us too early, the lives lived and taken from us. Delana Ashley Yaun, Paul Andre Michel, Xiao Jie Yan, Dao Yo Feng, Julie Park, and Hyunjun Park.
Thank you, Dr. Aguilera. So again, for those of you who for the first time are participating in an event sponsored by Enseñamos en el Valle Central, we are an initiative focused on cultivating future educators with a commitment to equity, liberation, and justice. These ongoing anti-racism discussions and the topics that we continue to unapologetically confront are all part of this work and a vision of realizing a K12 education system that embodies anti-racist epistemologies. I want to briefly provide us with the shared definition of anti-racism, a concept with deep roots in abolition, a call to end slavery, and the call for structural changes in eradicating institutional racism in a post-emancipation society. Anti-racism places a central focus on the deeply embeddedness of racism and white supremacy in systems of power, daily policies, and everyday practices. This process of systemic racism and violence of white supremacy is also very much tied to gender violence, patriarchy, misogyny, and a long history of sexual violence and hatred against Asian women, Black women, women of African descent, Chicana, Mexicana, Central American, and Latin American women, Indigenous, Native, and American Indian women, trans women. This history includes state-sponsored violence that is embedded throughout the country and state and here in the land of Yokuts, and it persists today. Genocide, enslavement, incarceration, Sutter, Tulea, Mariposa, Bloody Rock, Keysville, Oak Run, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Bracero Program, immigrant detention centers, the exploitation of agricultural workers, service workers, whose health and safety remain an afterthought to our society. So these are all reminders of an ongoing exploitation of racialized bodies. And it's a reminder of historical and racialized trauma among racialized communities. So with that, I want us to be open to what our presenters, to knowing these narratives, honoring those who then and now are enduring the legacy of racism, commit to unlearning the conditioning of internalized racism, and recognizing that we cannot heal a society of racism or systems of oppression without discomfort or devoid of structural changes and anti-racist policies. I want to again thank my colleagues who have joined us today to share what these daily actions can look like in practice. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to my colleague, Dr. Aguilera, to introduce us to our panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you. Maraming salamat sa iyo, Dr. Lopez, and maraming pong salamat sa inyong lahat. Thank you for joining us. Just a couple of quick logistical notes. This is the first of 3 events of our Spring 2021 Anti-Racism Virtual Teach-In Series. We're here today to focus and to learn together about topics specifically around diaspora, anti-Black racism, and race relations. We really want to emphasize the mode that we're engaging in today, one of open-minded learning from one another, and in particular, from our featured panelists. You can use the chat to engage with one another, as some of you already have, in this mode of learning throughout our time together. A little bit later, well, we'll begin with about 20 to 25 minutes for each panelist or each group of panelists. And during that time, you can submit questions in our Q&A box if you happen to be on Zoom. And if you are on Facebook Live, we'll do our best. We do have folks in there to field some of those questions and send them directly to our panelists. If you do have a specific question for a particular panelist, please note this in your question. And then we'll take some time after after all of our presentations, rather, to answer as many questions as we're able to in the short time that we have together. And so with this, I'll just briefly introduce our panelists, although of course they're welcome to address any other aspects of their own personal introductions that they would like to. Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Takara Brunson, Assistant Professor in the Africana Studies program here at California State University, Fresno. Takara Brunson is a professor in the African American Studies Department at California State University, Fresno. Some of her current work in progress includes Enacting Citizenship, Black Women and the Making of Modern Cuba, 1886 to 1959. Her research and teaching interests are in women, African diaspora, Latin American, and the Caribbean, and cultural and political history. We're also joined today by Dr. Patrick DeWalt, Assistant Professor in the Department of Liberal Studies here at the university. Dr. DeWalt received his PhD at the University of Colorado at Boulder and was born and raised in Houston, Texas. Dr. DeWalt's research interests include racial and cultural identity with an emphasis on the African diaspora, teacher education, and issues of diversity and curriculum development through the incorporation of digital media, theory, and pedagogy. Before pursuing his terminal degree, Dr. DeWalt taught within the Houston Independent School District, primarily as a first grade teacher. Dr. DeWalt's educational background includes, among other topics, biology, business, education, and cultural studies. Each of these areas and experiences then allows for an interdisciplinary approach to his research as well as his teaching and learning. We're very honored today as well to be joined by Fernando Santillan, Chicanx Studies teacher at Edison High School within the Fresno Unified School District. Fernando graduated from Fresno State with a double major in history and Chicano Latino studies. Fernando received his teaching credential in social science with a bilingual certification from Sac State. Fernando is currently in his 5th year of teaching at Edison High School in Southwest Fresno. And during his tenure at Edison, he established and wrote the curriculum for Chicanx Studies. Fernando also teaches race and social justice, an alternative to the U.S. history graduation requirement, and established a Mecha chapter at his school. Finally, we are very honored today to be joined by Lauren Beale, Ethnic Studies and African American Studies teacher at Edison High School, also here at FUSD. Lauren is a social science teacher who is committed to inquiry-based learning that connects the past with the present. Lauren spearheaded the introduction of ethnic studies at Edison High School by championing African American Studies as a course. In addition to her work in the social sciences and ethnic studies field, she's also advised multicultural clubs such as the Black Student Union and the Ujima program. So once again, thank you to all 4 of our panelists today. And I will go ahead and pass the mic directly to Dr. Brunson.
All right, good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin as I pull up my slideshow. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Lopez for inviting me to speak today. I've really enjoyed the collaborative process of planning for today's event, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. My contribution will focus on how I teach the concepts of diaspora, race, and racism as an Africana Studies professor. So my classes examine the lives of Black people in the United States and globally. I emphasize that Black individuals, whether born in the United States or having immigrated here, are part of the African diaspora. The African diaspora refers to the spread of African peoples from the continent to other parts of the world that include Asia and the Middle East, Europe, and throughout the Americas. It includes migratory patterns that have taken place for millennia. Black populations who currently reside in the US are part of a modern diaspora that began with the rise of the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism during the 15th century. Now, this history is important for at least 3 reasons. First, as this map that I've included here, the 10 to 12 million individuals purchased as property in West, Central, and Southeast Africa were transported to all parts of the Americas. And again, if you zoom in to look at the map, you'll notice that each line coming out of Africa highlights the various points at which Africans were purchased and forced to embark on ships that sailed across the Atlantic. And so the thickness gives you a sense of the kind of the portion or percentage of Africans brought out of the continent in comparison to other parts of the continent. And then you'll see arrows indicating where they ended up, again, with the thickness showing where the greatest percentage ended up versus the smallest percentage. Hopefully you can also notice some of the numbers indicating the numbers that came out of West, Central, and East Africa, and then the numbers that were brought to the Americas, right? So as a result of populations of African descent whose histories are tied to slavery can be found from Canada throughout Mexico and Central America, and in every nation of South America, right? So this includes a population, again, that is descended from Africans who were enslaved in these now existing countries, but it also includes the post-slavery migrations of immigrants who've moved from one nation to another. In fact, what you will hopefully also notice by looking at this map is that less than 5% of that 10 to 12 million Africans brought to the Americas ended up in what is currently the United States, right? Most Africans who were enslaved in the Americas ended up in either Brazil or one of the Caribbean islands. So that's my first point. The second reason why this history is important, because anti-Black racism is a legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. And so there are certainly nuances that you'll find when looking at each national context, yet there are also commonalities in terms of practices of racial stereotyping, higher rates of poverty found among populations of African descent, and contemporary issues with racism and policing. Third, many Africans and African descendants have emphasized a shared connection that unifies Black people across national boundaries, as they have recognized cultural commonalities, including music traditions, food, and dance. And that also emphasize experiences with global forms of anti-Black racism. One of the most contemporary iterations of this includes looking at histories of the Civil Rights Movement, Black Power movement, and anti-colonial struggles in Africa and the Caribbean, during which activists and artists moved across national boundaries to develop common strategies for addressing the forms of discrimination that they were confronting. So you can find this map and others online by Googling the Slave Voyages database. And this is really a great source for looking into histories of the transatlantic slave trade, even being able to look at individual voyages and some of the records that are available, excuse me. Now, when focusing on race and racism in the United States, I like to introduce the ideas of the following scholars. The first scholar is Dorothy Roberts, who is a scholar of Africana studies and the author of books that include Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. Roberts' work is useful for helping to frame histories of race and racism. And so right now I'm going to refer to her opening chapter in this book that I assign regularly for my freshman level courses. So her book introduces a chapter that explains how race and racism exist politically, right? And this is important in order to point out to students that race does not exist biologically. In fact, if you were to take people in this very session right now and look at our genetics, scientists have proven that you would find more in common across racial groups than you would find within racial groups, right? Race instead is socially constructed, and here Roberts builds on the work of other social scientists who demonstrate that race is a man-made idea, right? With its modern iteration having been created by propertied white men during European colonialism. These men determined that individuals from various parts of the world could be placed into racial categories based on their regional origins and physical appearance. They then created a racial hierarchy that placed white men at the top. Roberts shows how this process has unfolded from the 1600s through the present. And so she talks about 3 points, right? First, she shows how laws first established racial categories that included that of whites, Blacks, and then Native Americans. These were laws that rendered valid territorial expansion and Native American dispossession. These laws restricted slavery to Black people, right? So that being Black and being a slave became synonymous with each other. These laws also granted rights to white slaveholders over Black people as their property. They limited the rights of both enslaved and free Black people in terms of possessing arms, clothing, education, interracial marriage bans, and property ownership. Many of these laws were put in place to protect the interest, again, of propertied white men as slavery became more profitable, even discouraging potential alliances among Blacks and poor whites. So one of the events that Roberts cites in her chapter is that during Bacon's rebellion, you had free Black people form an alliance with poor whites to challenge the state, and how following this rebellion, the government implemented new laws that would grant privileges to those poor whites in order to encourage them to see themselves as a separate class from Black people and to no longer see them as allies as they sought to maintain those rights. These laws passed throughout US history, or first British colonial history and then US history, both reflected and helped create ideas about white superiority, Black inferiority, and racial purity, as well as, of course, class and gender distinctions. Now, another way that race operates as a political category is through our court system. And so Roberts talks about 52 cases that she examined between 1878 and 1952. This included cases that upheld racial segregation. It also included cases brought to the courts in the case that individuals with African heritage were sued by whites for having passed as white, especially in cases when people who were living as white people who presented in a manner similar to, say, Joe Biden and the current First Family were found to have had African heritage at some point in their line, and then the family that they married into sued them in order to annul their marriage and to try to protect their own family's bloodline, right? Court cases reflected attitudes expressed by white judges who ruled on whether or not Indian immigrants from India could legally identify as white and thus claim citizenship. It included cases that reinforced government acts to limit Asian immigration, and of course, they're shaping perceptions of anti-Asian or shaping anti-Asian sentiments that have continued to evolve throughout US history. And importantly, these cases, as Robert shows, validated common ideas and pseudoscientific theories as they politically defined race and restricted the category of citizenship. Finally, Roberts uses census categories to demonstrate how race remains unstable. So she cites that the first census of 1790 initially identified white men and white women of different age groups, who were then seen as separate from other free persons, and then slaves as a third racial category or social category. By 1800, the census created an Indian category to separate Native Americans from other free people. Again, the following century, the 1920 census separated Blacks from mulattoes or other multiracial individuals of European and African heritage. It included separate categories, each for those who were Filipino, Chinese, Korean, and Hindu. In terms of censuses, Mexicans were initially granted citizenship in 1848 and thus legally recognized as white. Yet Mexican is separated and established as its own category in the census of 1930. Roberts shows how the category of Hispanic appeared in later censuses during 1970 and again in 1980. And then finally, how the 2010 census provided 15 racial categories plus space to write in your own identity. Now, I use Roberts' chapter here to show how citizenship has been understood historically through its relationship to whiteness, and also to emphasize that racial categories are constantly evolving because they are socially constructed, and again, not based in biological difference. So while using Roberts to talk about histories of race and racism, I use the work of Beverly Daniel Tatum to help students think more about the concept of racism in a contemporary context. And here I'll be citing some of her ideas put forth in her famous text, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And other conversations about race. So Tatum in her text establishes that racism is different from prejudice, right? That anyone can be prejudiced because prejudice is about holding stereotypical ideas about a person of a racial group, right? On the other hand, racism is about understanding how discrimination and processes of advantaging particular groups exist at a systemic level. And in my classroom, I incorporate this theory to emphasize for students that racism is not simply these overt acts that many of them imagine when thinking about racial slurs or the KKK. Also that racism was not resolved with the passage of civil rights legislation during the 1960s, but rather it persists, and that it has evolved since the civil rights movement in important ways that can help push against their ideas that for many that we live in a colorblind society. So I use Tatum's work to help students shift from thinking about racism as an individual act or as something in the past to again thinking about racism as being systemic. And what's useful is that Tatum cites David Wellman, who defines racism, quote, as a system of advantage based on race. Of course, and then in talking about the United States, we're looking at a system of advantage that advantages white people while disadvantaging non-white people. Wellman also talks about how white people work to defend their racial advantage in employment, housing, politics, and other aspects of American society. Now, when Tatum uses this model, she talks about how systemic racism involves cultural messages, as well as institutional policies and practices, and finally, the beliefs and actions of individuals. Right? Now, students and I spend a good amount of time focusing on systemic racism in the media, policing, and prisons. And so I'll just walk through this process here for a few minutes. First, in terms of cultural messaging, we look at what the news conveys about what even constitutes a crime. So what particular acts are considered a crime, why they're considered a crime, and how they relate to people of different racial groups. This includes perceptions of who is more likely to commit certain crimes, especially those that are considered bad crimes like selling drugs or gang violence, and how those accused of a crime should be punished versus excused. So looking at how the media treats those who come from white backgrounds, being more likely to be explained as having some sort of mental issue or kind of having lived a good life and gone wrong, versus people coming from Black and Latino communities in particular, not being given the same type of analysis by the daily news sources, right? Second, in looking at institutional policies and practices, we talk about the different decisions made about how to report the news, right? These decisions, as well as how to patrol particular neighborhoods more heavily than others, especially those that are more affluent, neighborhoods that tend to be more white and affluent. We look at decisions made in terms of which individuals to stop, in terms of those who come from a particular racial group, decisions to arrest and charge particular individuals, as well as to imprison particular individuals or individuals who have committed certain crimes or been accused of committing certain crimes. And this includes what length of sentence to give individuals, and the ways that this reflects how, again, white people are disadvantaged as well as how how white people are advantaged and how non-white people are disadvantaged. Certainly there is overlap between messages, policies and practices, and the belief systems, beliefs and actions of individuals, right? Ultimately, people act on their beliefs that some racial groups are more prone to engage in activities considered criminal, while others are not. Here, I highlight this last point or emphasize this point because it shows that people can make these decisions both consciously and unconsciously, but more importantly, that you do not have to be white to engage in practices that advantage white people. So when we talk about a lot of many of the issues in terms of the violent treatment of people in Black communities by police officers, it's noted that oftentimes these police officers are not white, but are even Black, and that Black officers are still, do not resolve issues related to police brutality and police killings. Right? Now, talking about policing and prisons as they affect Black Californians is necessary for disrupting student perceptions of the state as a liberal paradise, right? A lot of the students who come into my classes think about racism, especially the bad, more overt and violent forms of racism, as something that exists in the South, right? Especially because they associate the South with slavery and Jim Crow, whereas they see California as a place of power, or as progress and of liberal politics, right? I like to use our model or framing of systemic racism to trouble that notion, right? I also use this model of systemic racism to highlight issues that might potentially unify marginalized populations, right? Including Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos, right? And so here I'll just highlight a few last examples. So going back to racism, policing, and prisons, most people tend to associate police brutality with Black people, right? And it makes sense. When you watch the news, when you see the videos of police brutality, whether it includes an officer or security guard tackling a teenage girl outside of the pool in her community, or if you see a man being strangled or beaten in the streets, oftentimes these videos feature Black people. Right? And in fact, if you look at the graphic that I've posted here from 2019, you'll see that while African Americans are 13.4% of the population, African Americans were 23.4% of those killed by police officers, right? But what that also shows is that if Black people are 23.4% of those killed by officers, the overwhelming majority, more than 75% of those killed by officers, were not Black, right? Which again, I think troubles what students think of in terms of policing, police brutality in prisons, because suddenly they see that in fact, the majority of individuals killed by police are white, right? And yet, if you look at the numbers, that white people are 60.4% of the US population, are only 36.8% of those who are killed by police, right? And there we're able to talk about the kind of reasons behind that that leads to Black people being more likely to be killed when confronted by police, and for white people being less likely to be killed when confronted by police, right? Finally, this graph highlights that those who are Hispanic or Latino, though 18.3% of the population, are 15.7% of the population. So less in terms of who's being killed in comparison with the population, but still a significant percentage of those who are killed by police. And again, this is a dynamic that we do not see being discussed in the mainstream media, especially not at the national level, right? A few more examples. So in terms of challenging this myth of California as being a liberal paradise, again, Black people in the state are 8% of the population. Between 2010 and 2020, just in the county of Los Angeles, Black people were 25% of those killed by police, right? Similarly, Latinos were 49% of the population during the same period, yet 53% of those killed by police. White people living in Los Angeles were 26% of the population, and 19% of those killed by the police. And then those who were Asian residents of Los Angeles County were 15%, and 3% of those killed by police. So again, you can see some of the racial disparities that challenge this idea that Californians just get along and that there are fewer racial issues here in the state than there would be in other parts of the country, especially the South. We also see issues of racism in terms of those who are being stopped by the police when looking at racial and ethnic distinctions, right? And what's interesting about this particular graph is that you see that in the case of Latinos, whites, and Asians, that these are populations that are less likely to be stopped, right? In comparison to their population size. Yet if you switch and look at African Americans and those who are identified as Middle Eastern or South Asian, that these are groups that are more likely or who are overrepresented in terms of those who are stopped by the police in the state of California. If we look at the major branches of the police forces throughout the state of California, so including the California Highway Patrol, the police departments of LA, San Diego, San Francisco, as well as the sheriff's departments of LA, San Bernardino, Riverside, and San Diego. You'll see again that Black people, though a much smaller percentage of the population, and in each case less than 10% of the population in those areas, are way overrepresented in terms of those who are stopped by police officers. When we look at those who are pulled over by police, right, throughout the state, but especially in the Bay Area, we again see that not only are Black people overrepresented in terms of those who are pulled over by the police, but so are those who are Hispanic or Latino. And so here again is another point of connection around which students can mobilize and a point through which we can build coalitions to challenge anti-Black racism. So if you see just by looking at point 1, it highlights that Black people, though 8.4% of the population in the Bay Area, are 30.5% of those stopped by police officers, whereas whites are 56% of the population, but 36.7% of those stopped by the police. And then Hispanics and Latinos are 33% of the population, but 57% stopped, right? So I'll just stop there, but I do want to conclude by offering this as one model that might be useful for each of you to examine, teach, and discuss anti-Black racism in your classrooms and broader community. Thank you.
Okay, I was muted. Okay, so let's start again. So Dr. Brunson's work, I think, sets a great way as a segue for our conversation we're about to have now on anti-Black racism 2.0. And so part of what I want to do is I put in the first slides as a representation, and I'm going to kind of pass through some of these things in terms of acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge those who've been contributors in terms of how this idea formed. So again, Dr. Herbert Exum, Dr. Janelle Pitt, Dr. Alicia Beckton, Dr. Dominique Griffin, of course, and Siamos. So I want to acknowledge those as well. So in revisiting this idea of this historical conversation, part of what I want us to do is when we look at slides 4 through 10, that's going to be more of the context that was drawn from the previous presentation that we did in previous conversations, but I wanted to have that there as context for those of you who may be new to this discussion. So as we acknowledge those who have been, who've fallen in Atlanta, we want to also acknowledge those who've fallen in other contexts as well, in similar ways in which Dr. Brunson had pointed out within her conversation. So I want to continue going on because I want to get to the core of our conversation, but I want to make sure that we never forget these names and all the others that we don't have listed here. Another thing that I want to highlight is this idea that America is not another word for opportunity to all her daughters and sons. And so we think of having this conversation around anti-Black racism or racism in general, we see in ways in which there is a legacy or a continued purpose for discrimination. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And in order to have this conversation, I just want to bring up these concepts of prejudice and discrimination. But again, these are things that have been highlighted. So I want to kind of continue on. But again, it's key to talk about these in terms of positive and or negative. And I want those of you who are either currently teaching or those who are currently working towards teaching is to remembering that all of us carry these things with us. That our challenge and our charge is how do we self-check ourselves when we're in front of our students and with others in our community? How do we stay mindful of those things that we have, but without using those to harm our students? I want to go ahead and quickly highlight the 5 principles that Jones illustrates. So again, this racial superiority and inferiority. Moving on to point 3, this idea of a doctrine, as well as elements of human thought and behavior that follow from the abstract properties. So when we think about this idea of diaspora that has been laid out earlier, we see some of the way this is playing out in terms of how we see Black people, Black folk, or people of African descent, and others within this nation. These three factors, and I want to focus primarily on institutional racism, cultural racism, and talk about these two, because again, when we think about, as Dr. Brunson brought up, some of the laws that have been put in place have been put in place part to continue and to perpetuate those harms that are against non-white people and others who have been placed in, who are seen as other. So I want to also come back to this idea of anti-Blackness. And so I want to focus on this piece here in terms of this 2-part formation that both strips Blackness of value, dehumanizes, and systematically marginalizes Black people. The form of anti-Blackness is overt racism. Society also associates politically incorrect comments with the overt nature of anti-Black racism. So I want you all to continue to think about these things as I move to slide 10. And I want you all to think about these concepts as a lens for how we're going to discuss things, starting with slide 12. Before we can go on to slide 12, I want to make sure we take a moment to acknowledge some of those who represent the legacy as we talk about Black struggle or African American struggle and progress as well. So this brings me to something that I've been thinking about a lot as we discuss issues of race, and particularly anti-Black racism, is this idea of empathy. And so I use Taleb's work in terms of this working definition. Empathy is not technically an emotion, but a gauge by which we try to feel what others feel. And so when we think about the legacy and the history of the United States, my question remains, or my concern remains, the United States still has an empathy problem. And why do I say this? Brings me to my next important point. So we're going to set the context. So it's 2021. So why do the 60s still matter? And so when we think about the 60s, we think about some of the things that are happening. I want to focus on 3 particular points legislatively. And first, there's going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Second, Voting Rights Act of 1965. And finally, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And so part of what I want to do is I want to tease elements of each to see how this forms into our current discussion, our current concerns. So in looking at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what this is doing is really addressing some of the societal ills as it pertains to oppression for those who are of African descent. And this was being used in ways to address those laws, such as we see here in terms of Jim Crow laws, Plessy versus Ferguson, and talking about the ways in which the Supreme Court had played a role in addressing some of these. And so it's also interesting to say the role in which the Supreme Court is currently, or has historically within the last 20 years, played a role in reducing some of those strengths that were placed within this bill as well, this legislation as well. Next, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So as we move forward as a nation to address some of the societal ills that were addressed in the Civil Rights Act, we see that voting became more and more of a concern. Again, looking at the way in which persons of Black descent, African descent, as well as allies who coalesced around this idea that in terms of equality and social justice. And so as we look at this, Congress passes the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and we talk about this pre-clearance from either the U.S. Attorney General. And one of the key pieces of this is going to be talking about Section 5. And this is where it talks about the role in which the the Attorney General plays in making sure that states are not practicing or discriminating against those who were eligible to vote. And then we currently see right now that these things are in jeopardy yet again, because some of these things have been pushed back. And we see these things happening in of all places, Georgia. The second thing I want to point out in terms of this is that the most significant statutory change in the relationship between the federal and state governments in the area of voting since the Reconstruction. So again, when we think about the role in which civil rights has played to steer the table, steer us and push us towards equality in terms of voting rights, it now leads us to this next piece. When we think about Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, before we can even talk about that, the Hart-Celler Act, there are so many pieces to this puzzle that layer and layer. And what I want to bring to your attention in terms of this is, in many of these, we see the way in which institutional and systemic racism are at work. And part of what I want to point out is that this particular immigration, or this Immigration Nationality Act, actually of 1965, not the precursors, but 1965, is where you see that the civil rights as well as the voting rights have pushed Congress in terms of recognizing that how the nation looked abroad. And so some of these things have but before we can get there, I want to provide some context of how previous legislation create the reason for this act to even be there. And so there are several acts that precede this, and I provide within this presentation a link so that those of you who have access to this, you'll be able to actually see some of the other materials, but I want to focus on these in particular. So the Immigration Act of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, and I want to highlight a couple of parts of this. So in 1924, it limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States through a national origins quota. And so this quota was passed in a previous act, but again, so in thinking about this idea of a quota, so we're saying, the nation is saying, deciding who is actually going to be able to have access to this nation, as we simultaneously talk as we're a nation of immigrants. And so in looking at this, the quota provided immigration visas to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the United States. Now, in terms of this, it also limited who could come in as well. And so it's important for us to acknowledge that. And so something that was talked about earlier, the Chinese Exclusion Act that was talked about earlier as we opened, these things fall together and these things are tied together. And it's important for us as educators to, especially those who are working in history, social science, and all of those areas that talk towards civics education, that we remind ourselves and our students of these important historical moments that help to explain what is currently going on in our nation today. Number two, the Nationality Act of 1940 defined nationality at birth in the mainland United States and in the US territories, limited nationality cases to certain courts and revised eligibility requirements for naturalized. So again, we think about the way in which the nation is doing some of the things to exclude those while simultaneously privileging certain community groups that historically have been privileged. And so as we continue, I want to go to the next piece. So when we look at this Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act, the thing I want to highlight here is that it revises that system, that 1924 system. It continues this idea of this national quota. So again, thinking about the ways in which those who were seeking to access the nation, to the United States, how they are being determined. And that's really important. So again, thinking about this in terms of power. So one of the big things in terms of systemic racism is this aspect of power. And we're seeing the way in which this power is in display in the way in which legislation is being formed in the term of policy. So as we look at this, the national quotas at a rate of 1/6 of 1% of each nationality's population in the United States in 1920. As a result, 85% of the 154,000 plus visas available annually were allotted to individuals of Northern and Western Europe lineage. So again, even as these laws are being put in place, they're being put in place to address and privilege certain groups, and typically non-white groups. So as we talk about this is an important context that shapes the actual law itself. So when we look at the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965, as this is being done, one of the things that I found really fascinating is that what it actually did, they didn't think it would do. So in no point in time when they were crafting this legislation, did they believe that it would increase the number of non-white immigrants to the degree it did. And so it's important to note that, but it also talks back to capitalism. It talks back to the way in which part of the reason why this was done is to get skilled workers. And so in many ways in which for an Immigration Nationality Act, it allowed for those who were here to bring in family members who may be abroad and being tied to family. And so again, we see some of the reasons that things were happening. And I think this is really important for us to think about today, especially in light of what's happening against our members of our community who are Asian. So as we look at the way in which the laws have changed to allow our community to grow and to be diversified, we have to also understand that this was not the intended consequence that was thought about when this legislation was crafted. And so why is all of this important? Because my argument here is that without the roles and the Black struggle that amounted, and allies that amounted to the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, we do not have this opportunity for the removal of traditional quotas that allowed many groups from different nationalities that were non-white to have access at a greater degree in the United States. And I think that's really important for us to think about as we talk about this idea of coalition, as we talk about this idea of coming together around issues of racism, anti-racism. And it also is very important as we think about the power and the responsibilities we have as we seek to educate a diverse population, which makes up our society. So again, part of what I want to really drive home here is that I challenge all of us who are teaching in history and social science in particular, that we revisit these things and bring these things to the forefront to help our young people and ourselves understand what the legacy that we're currently still being impacted by in terms of the legislation that is being based off of these previous identified artifacts that we're talking about here. So now, why also have I said this? I want to kind of bring this to a more current space. So when we think about this person in particular, so any of you have seen the film, Judas and the Black Messiah, part of watching that reminded me of how all of this stuff in terms of the legislation that took place in this period of 60s. Now we're talking about 65. And so in this conversation that's happening in 69 prior to his death in December of 1969, this particular conversation he's having is rooted in education for liberation in terms of revolution. So before I play this video, I want to make sure this is clear, that this excerpt is Fred Hampton as Fred Hampton is. And part of what I want you to understand, and he's talking about this in terms of revolution, he's talking about this in terms of the context of the 60s. And he's talking about the ways in which this is going in the spirit of this idea of coalition, right? In liberation. So I want to go ahead and play it now.
Let me give you an example. Jomo Kenyatta formed the excellent revolution with no education. And on the day of the end thing, Yomo told the motherfucker, I said, well, you know, you can educate hate the enemy, but I'm your brother. I let help you beat the revolution. Now I'm more pressure. Another example, Papa Doc in Haiti. Papa Doc in Haiti hated everything white. Man, you couldn't put this white paper in front of Papa Doc's face, but he moved all the white people out and he took over and be oppressed. He did, causing no education. And the people that have been educated, they just said that we don't hate the motherfucker white people, we hate the oppressor, whether he be white, black, brown, or yellow. So we got to know the educational program to find out what is going to be in the finale. A lot of people, Yomo Kenyatta is called not a never revolutionary, but an ex-revolutionary. So it's Papa Doc. They brought on a successful revolution. That thing in the Miles was a bitch. Bantu freedom fighters, all that kind of action. What we're saying is the end. But you don't judge Castro now. You can't do it. Nobody in this room could judge whether Castro's going to be a revolutionary or not. You know what I mean? We're talking about things, you know what I mean, with China, the People's Republic, and even at the stage they're in now, talking about even going on further into a communistic state. That's what we're talking about. Those are revolutionary. So we got to understand here the educational program that you have to be able to figure out whether it will go on the right lines where the people will end up in a situation where they can be able to really control themselves. You understand what I'm saying? With no education, the people take this local foundation and start stealing money because they won't be really educated to why it's the people's thing anyway. You understand what I'm saying? With no education, you have neo-colonialism instead of colonialism, like you got in Africa 9, like you got in Haiti. So what we're talking about is there has to be an educational program. That's very important. As a matter of fact, it's so important for us that a person has to go through 6 weeks of our political education before he can consider himself a member of the party, able to even run down ideology for the party. Why? Because if they don't have an education, then they're nowhere. You know what I'm saying? They're nowhere because they don't even know why they're doing what they're doing. You might get people caught up in the emotionalist movement. You understand me? You might get them caught up in because they're poor and they want something. And then if they're not educated, they want more. And before you know it, they'll be capitalist. And before you know it, we have Negro imperialists.
And this was spoken in 1969, yet much of what he stated is currently on display across our nation. And so what I want us to think about—
let me give you an example. Yomo Kenyatta
is this idea of educational martyrism. And the reason why I want to bring this out is because in many ways, what he represented and his ideas represented put him at risk. And ultimately he was assassinated. And so part of what we have to think about as educators is if we're going to seriously be about being anti-racist, anti-black race, in terms of anti-black racism as well, and if we're going to be allies to all across the nation, whether you're in the Bay Area or whatnot, then we have to understand what that really means. We have to understand that we have to be willing to stand up for our students. We have to be willing to stand up for the communities in which our students our students are living. That means we have to be willing to go to those communities and extend ourselves, because we cannot expect for our communities, and we also have to recognize what our communities bring. Because when I talk about education and when he's talking about education, he's not confining education to the institution. So let me make sure that I clearly say that. He is not defining education based on the school district. Education happens outside of the school as well. And that's also equally important. And so if we are going to be serious about anti-racism, then we also have to think about the way in which we interrogate the curriculum that we teach that often is racist in itself. And that's a challenge, that's a charge, and that's a commitment that each of us have to be thinking about if we're going to be serious about educating our students to combat issues of racism that are here within our nation and are fundamentally here based on the laws and policies that have occurred time and time again. And again, and part of what I want you all to do when you get a chance to look at the PowerPoint is I want you to go to a particular document, and it lays out all of these different policies that have happened over time that are building upon one another for exclusion or excluding people in the community. So excluding people who look like us from access. And that's really important for us to think about as we hear these current conversations of exclusion, as we hear current conversation around immigration, as we have current conversation around voting rights, as we have current conversation around the retarding of civil rights. So if we are truly committed to what we say we are and what we're here to be a part of, then we have to take a stand to where we put ourselves, we incur a level of risk and sacrifice for the benefit of our community and our students. So as I move forward, lessons from Fred Hampton that I want to leave you all with. Racism is our enemy in education, not schooling is our weapon. That education needs to also be coming from funds of knowledge. It needs to be coming recognizing what the community has already there, but also recognizing what Carter G. Woodson said is that there's also miseducation within our communities as well. So we as educators have to balance, in other words, I would call it, we have to take a delicate dance in terms of making sure that we prepare our young people to be successful within the context of schools without sacrificing the knowledge that their communities cultivate outside of school. So our challenge is finding a way to unify those for the benefit of not only our students, but for our communities, which also ultimately benefits us as educators. And secondly, educating ourselves and each other is a core to our coalition. So if you are serious about this, that means we're gonna have to pull up our sleeves and get to work with one another. And some of those things require having those difficult conversations where we challenge each other for the greater good. And again, the greater good is the communities and the communities in which our students are situated and where we work. And then lastly, the roles that we play as educators and teacher educators have the potential and promise to achieve this, but it requires a commitment and tenacity that recognizes us in this way. So I would like to leave you with a few references. And when you get the slide, here are some of their attributions. And again, I want to thank you all for your time.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Lauren Beale. I teach at Edison High School, African American Studies, as well as various social sciences.
Hi, Fernando Santillan. I teach Chicanic Studies and Race and Social Justice at Edison. Just neighbors with Lauren here.
And before we get started for our presentation, we really wanted to offer a trigger warning. We went on the track of identifying tangible instances of anti-Blackness that appear in our school setting. So there are disturbing images, videos that show what anti-Blackness is and what anti-Blackness does. So we wanted to definitely give a trigger warning before that. So as Dr. DeWalt already said very clearly in his presentation, anti-Blackness is a two-part formation, one that strips Blackness of value, trying to dehumanize Black people, and also seeks to systematically marginalize them. Our presentation is really focused on a two-part ways in which anti-Blackness approaches. The first is in an overt form of anti-Blackness. So it's the intentional, obvious, harmful attitudes that exist. This is the easiest way to kind of see and describe anti-Black racism. The next, though, is this covert form of anti-Blackness that is more insidious, more concealed, and less obvious to people who are not aware of how it can show up in a day-to-day school setting. So we wanted to focus on three areas in which overt anti-Black racism exists. So first is our standards and curriculum. So standards are what we teach students. Curriculum is how we teach students. School policies are the set established expectations for specific behavior and norms. And then lastly is racist educators. And we went with the definition of Dr. Kendi's work. A racist educator is one who is supporting a racist policy through action or inaction or expressing a racist idea. So within school policies, this idea of how students are expected to behave. We have things like dress code to begin with. So dress codes are the ways in which students are expected to appear in schools. And we clipped some various images of things that were happening that were obviously rooted in anti-Blackness. So we have a high school wrestler who was forced to cut his hair in a championship game. He could either cut his hair or lose a wrestling championship. The next is from the Indianapolis Star, which is painted as a touching moment of a principal helping a student return to class with a haircut. Well, before this touching moment took place, this student was removed from class because he refused to remove his do-rag. And when his Black principal asked him, why aren't you removing your do-rag? His response was, my barber messed up my lineup. That was his response, right? So if you're a part and aware of Black culture, especially, that's really a big deal, right? Is your style, your hair, the way you present yourself. And this is across the board in child development, right? Is how your peers see you then. So what is painted as a touching moment, aside from this principal stepping in as an intermediary, was an anti-Black moment. We also painted local context here in Fresno. So a Fresno Unified student was kicked out of school based off a popular haircut that school officials didn't like, right? So he had a design in his head. He's an honor roll student that was removed from class because of a design part. Adding on to that are things like in Houston high schools, parents are banned from wearing ripped jeans or mini dresses or wearing hair bonnets when they appear in school. And these are ways in which they try to cut off Black culture, cut off Black pride, and really attacking Black bodies. So this is a quote from a campaign director at Color of Change. She says, they're particularly meaningful because Black women and girls are being penalized for the way their hair literally grows out of their heads. And this is talking about oftentimes Black girls who get braids that are not allowed in schools because they're viewed as ghetto, right? If you're suspended from school because of the way that you wear your hair, how are you supposed to have faith or confidence in your school and that the staff in the institution cares about you? So this is just one example of a school policy that is overtly anti-Black, right? And being able to identify the reasons why. The next is about policing in schools. So I'll go ahead and play this clip to provide some context if you are unaware of policing in schools.
The school to prison pipeline. It's a term that describes how American kids get pushed out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Basically, harsh zero-tolerance policies in schools have led to more suspensions, expulsions, and even in-school arrests. Getting suspended or expelled means more time away from school, and it doesn't take an honor student to figure out that's bad news. In fact, expelled and suspended students are more likely to get held back a grade, end up in juvie, or just drop out altogether. And dropping out of high school makes you 3 times more likely to get arrested. Back in school, forget about hallway monitors. Students these days often have to deal with school police. Minor offenses that might have landed you in the principal's office back in the day can now actually lead to your arrest. Students of color and those with disabilities are disproportionately affected. Black students get expelled 3 times more than their white classmates, while a student with a disability is 2 times more likely to get an out-of-school suspension than everyone else. And it's not because these kids are just bad apples. The Justice Department found that Black students got harsher punishments than their white peers for doing the same things. So maybe it's time our education system got schooled?
So that right there is a clip of the school to prison pipeline. To provide a more local context, in the California Department of Education, they released a report that 38.4% of Fresno Unified students were suspended, which is higher than the statewide average of 30.4%. And then higher also than the county average of 33.8%. When we're talking about data from the Fresno Police Department, in 2019, Black students only made up 7% of Fresno Unified student population, but accounted for 25% of all school arrests. Black students also had the highest suspension rates during that same school year. Black students in Fresno County as a whole were among the top who missed school days due to suspensions and losing a rate about 105 days of school per year. So while we're in this context of COVID and a global pandemic and distance learning, and the idea of loss of learning, right? We also should be critical of the things that happened prior to this, right? 105 days of a school year being missed out on. So what Fresno Unified decided to do as a result to community pushback is issue a report on, okay, what is policing in schools? And many community organizations are finding some of the things that were issued in this study to be flawed. So Fresno Unified spent $50,000 approximately on the research. And the student voices only account for 114 students that agree, from a small student group, that agree with police remaining on our campuses. Well, I teach more than 114 students in a week, right? I have more than 114 students on my roster. So out of 70,000 students, 114 simply can't account for real and accurate data concerning this issue of campus policing. To further that, I've had instances in my own classroom where students are literally picked up out of a classroom and sent to juvenile hall with no SEL supports after that, both for staff, students, and teachers. The student is just literally taken and placed in a cell. And that is the student's understanding then of the criminal justice system, that an officer is allowed to walk into a classroom and you're never going to see your classmate again. Without any context, any explanation, that was it. And then Fernando will speak about examples of racist educators.
Thank you, Lauren. So here on the screen, what we have is, again, a few screenshots of a few different incidents that have happened here in Fresno Unified. And we have things from Fresno Unified, Clovis Unified, etc. And we also have this video here that we will show you that's pretty recent. We have highlighting a few of the quotes. So let's go ahead and play this video, and then we'll talk about the impact of this.
Dr. G is doing that whole thing about Brianna. I'm sorry she was killed, but you know, when you hang out with people with guns that shoot at cops, you're likely to get caught in the crossfire. I'm very sorry. I'm confused. Dr. G is on the announcements reading about, what's her name, Brianna something, the one that was killed in the gunfire from the cops. She was hanging out with the guy who was wanted on charges. They had that, and he fired at them and they fired back. You know, if you hang out with people who are criminals and they shoot at a cop, you're likely to get caught in the crossfire. It does not matter what color your skin is, you're likely to get caught in the crossfire. I'm sorry I really, truly, it's sad that she put herself in that position. But she put herself in that position by hanging out with somebody she shouldn't have been with.
That's her boyfriend, which means she can't be with her.
Okay, here's the thing. She was with her boyfriend who was a criminal.
That was her ex-boyfriend. They came to the wrong house.
Yeah, they came, bro, what?
That was her ex-boyfriend. He didn't live there anymore.
What, did he fire the first shot though?
No, nobody shot anything. The cop shot first. If he shot, that was self-defense anyways, because that was the wrong house they was at. Come on, forensic science.
Okay. If you got a no-knock warrant, and besides that, I'll tell you right now.
The right guy was already in custody earlier that day.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, like I said, I'm sorry she's dead, but they actually have proof that he fired at them first. Now,
all right, let's talk about that.
Let's talk about, you need to be writing a reporter's note. Dr. G is doing that whole thing. Dr. G is doing that whole thing about Brianna.
So, like, when I watched that, just a few things like really stood out to me. First of all, Richard, right? Richard and the other student there that were put in the position to have to speak up, right? And this is a few things that I see in the video, right? Just the teacher's lack of fundamental knowledge about the case indicates how Black experiences are minimized in school, right? She's a forensic science teacher talking about something that she doesn't know anything about in the class where you're supposed to build arguments based off of evidence, right? And Richard had that line there. Come on, forensic science. The second one tries to claim that these Black lives is devoid of value, right? She mentions it repeatedly, and her blatant disregard for collective grieving that occurs within Black communities is also a form of anti-Blackness, right? So let's just think about the experience from the perspective of these students, right? And how does this impact the students' relationship to school, right? In addition to all the other things Lauren just said, right? All of a sudden, you realize that this conversation happened and that you and one other person like really had your back, right? So now it becomes, you know, it shifts the relationship even with your classmates, right? Can you trust your classmates that don't stand as your allies in that moment? The second one, the educators now become like a form of oppressors, right? She's really trying to minimize the collective grieving of the community of these students, right? So you really think about the way it becomes like this other world in your school versus your real world at home, right? So school no longer serves as your institution of truth, of knowledge and learning, and it just completely separates that connection, right? So in a sense, the school becomes a war zone on the intellectual, metaphysical, and physical wellness of students.
So when school becomes this war zone, Fernando and I both thought this was an apt quote from James Baldwin. To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all of the time and in one's work. And part of this rage is this: it isn't only what is happening to you, but it's what's happening all around you and all of the time in the face of the most extraordinary and criminal indifference of most white people in this country and their ignorance. She even asks Brianna who. So she's ill-informed about what she's even saying within the video. What's her name? What's her last name? So it shows that when students are placed in this school position and the teacher is saying anti-Black, racist, and spewing ideologies in a classroom, then what are students left with other than carrying around that rage in that context to school?
So just to add one more thing, just that I didn't cover earlier, and this is the reality of our school systems, right? This teacher in this video, the people that we put up there on the little snippets from the news, those teachers are still in the classroom, right? So the students still have to go back into that setting. These teachers just get at the most moved. But this is like a continuous thing, even after this experience, right? So some may think this teacher was off topic talking about the current events, but the reality is that these ideologies of anti-Blackness are even deeply rooted in our standards and curriculum. So we're going to be talking about the standards and curriculum here that we use in the state of California. I believe the history, social science standards were written in 1998. And then you do have a framework, right? That was last updated 2016 that kind of supports the history, social science standards, but the standards are the base, right? And really the framework comes from those standards. So we're going to focus on the standards, right? And this is just a few things that we came across here as we look through all these standards, right? Students get introduced to West African empires in 7th grade, right? Absent from the standards is like even this connection between these West African empires and the institution of slavery in the Americas, right? So absent from the standards is the Middle Passage, right? 8th grade begins with a struggle over slavery without mention of race, racism, or white supremacy. So you're talking about slavery as if it was kind of like this isolated thing without even interrogating systems, right? 9th grade, they don't have a social science class, but then in 10th grade, you have this here, you talk about the demise of the slave trade in the Industrial Revolution without even talking about the people, right? And then you have new imperialism and nation building in Africa and Latin America. But again, devoid from this is like the actual experiences through this system, right? In grade 11, you start talking about the effects of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and then World War II and civil rights. So this is where I teach. And so if you just stick with the standards, you end up trying to address the standard without actually putting it in the context. I start my class, like race and social justice, we start with Mansa Musa, right? And so this really highlights like the way it really, I think it's on the next slide actually. educational choices in the curriculum make oppression, slavery, and white supremacy seem passive, right? Like there's no real actors in there. Introduces Black people in 8th grade only in the context of slavery and frames them as passive participants instead of active resistors.
Okay, so therefore I think we must make choices as educators. Every choice we make as educators is therefore political. And we must choose to root out anti-Blackness. The side of anti-racism is our survival and our means to thrive. And it's recognizing once again that many of these are overt forms of racism, but it's the covert forms that allow plausible deniability. Like for you to say, hey, it's in the standards, hey, it's in the textbook, rather than you interrogating what is around you yourself as a professional before you hand it over to Black students, and more importantly too, other students as well that are learning about Black experiences and Black people. So we're now going to speak to some of the ways in which we try to uproot these forms of anti-Blackness in our experiences as teachers. So personally, you know, we can't often talk about this in our classrooms because sometimes the district will come after you. That being said, you can use your personal social media pages, your personal time to start to advocate for some of these changes, building with local community and bringing local community into your classroom spaces on your lunchtime or after school periods, right? And Fresno Barrios Unidos is an organization that does great work. When I taught Women's Alliance, I partnered with them for their women's empowerment sessions. And you can see here that Ashley Rojas speaks about, at the end of the day, yes, policing systematically in schools is anti-Black, right? But what her quote here is saying is, there are lots of reasons not to pay educational dollars to police our young people. So not only are these systems, right, these disproportionate systems affecting Black students, but now we're also spending educational dollars within this context, right? In the middle of school budgets being cut, that's potentially about to come. In the middle of Fresno PD, which is a part of our school policing, being accused of having Proud Boy members, right? So what protections is our district offering when we're policing in schools? Next is a Fresno Ethnic Studies Coalition, a grassroots task force of myself, Fernando, and other teachers within the district that teach ethnic studies. And we try to focus on some of these outcomes as a way to resist some of these standards that are issued out by the state. So cultivating empathy, community actualization, self-worth, celebrating and honoring Native peoples and indigeneity, centering and placing high value on these pre-colonial structures, critiquing empire building in history and its relationship with white supremacy, challenging imperialist and colonial beliefs, connecting past and contemporary resistance movements to struggles of justice today, and reimagining new possibilities, right? And these frameworks can be embedded in classes that you already teach. So when you're looking at the standards, how can you embed these outcomes in the classes you teach? Is also a way to think about it. But ethnic studies is also being used as a tool of oppression as well, right? Ethnic studies may be used in other contexts to try to use ethnic studies as a way to say, we're celebrating this, but we actually don't want your liberation, that's a good way to frame it. So this is some of the students that we had in our ethnic studies classes for Fernando and I, some of the projects that we've done, particularly focused on the Black male experience oral histories projects, ranging from different age levels. And this is Fernando's part.
Yeah, this is a project that's centered on using critical race theory to analyze racial inequalities. And then students were then tasked to find the connections across these different racial inequalities found throughout our community. This was something that really highlighted like systems and kind of like the way systems impact multiple racial groups, right? And this one is a project that's something I start off with. We start in Chicano studies by talking about the history of ethnic studies and really focusing on the BSU at San Francisco State, and the way their struggles ended up in the Third World Liberation Front and the student strike. So then the students are tasked with creating a movie poster based off of that history, right? And as you can see, it really highlights racial solidarity and the impact of racial solidarity.
And some of the other things that Fernando and I have done within our class structures, once again, is doing Black and Brown collective consciousness. So I'm the advisor for Black Student Union. He's the advisor for MECHA on campus. Pre-COVID, when we were on campus, we did things like voter drives, partnered with the Dolores Huerta Foundation. We did joint conversations about racism in schools, problem-posing dialogue, have had students participate in silent protests of issues that they've recognized at school. And so also within this context is of ethnic studies, even though our classes are topical classes like African American studies and Chicanx studies, there are even comprehensive ethnic studies models like at Sunnyside, shout out to Uziel if he's still on here, who teaches this class. And his student talked about his experience at Sunnyside after taking the comprehensive ethnic studies class. And he realizes, wait a minute, my teachers have participated in forms of anti-Blackness, right? A teacher joked to a Black student about, you're bringing watermelon to the classroom potluck, right? And students not even recognizing that prior to this, that, oh, it's a funny joke. But why is that not funny when it's coming, well, when it's coming from anyone, but especially your teacher who was there to provide you with an education, to uplift you, right? And he begins to say that when we have classes like this, we can recognize anti-Blackness, right? Even if we are not Black ourselves, and building at this young age students' anti-racist ideologies. Also in my class, I would like to say especially that we push a lot on our district of things that our district is doing in terms of what is racist. So things like the Fresno High town hall, where they had both sides come and talk about their humanity, right? So a student is talking about how basically, this is students' words, like basically the event was whack. You had people like screaming about their traditions in the face of Indigenous people's actual lives. On the right-hand side, this is actually a student remind message from a Hmong student who we were analyzing political cartoons and their usage of anti-Asian racism. And this is from like the image of the 1800s. And she had seen it repurposed for COVID and texted me, hey, I was just on the internet and I ran across this and it reminded me of your class, some of the discussions we've had. And you could see my response, this is from 2020, like last year, that you have to call it out with your students. You have to say what is racist. You have to say what is xenophobic, what is white supremacy, so that students know, one, that you're on their side, right? But two, is that that is not okay, that the experiences that they are having by just casually running across the internet are not okay. This is a student that is not Black, that is taking African American studies, who talks about recognizing the importance of Black Lives Matter in a global context. And then, for anyone to end this one up?
Yeah, so this is, these are two former students of mine here that Katya on the right, she's gonna be sharing about how she feels about ethnic studies, how important it is, and really what the impact she thinks it could have on the community. I'll let her use her words. So.
I'm super passionate about this issue. I think it's very telling that these classes weren't already offered at our school or at our district, especially at a school that prides itself on diversity. You know, what are we teaching students of with a, you know, we promote ourselves a lot on like, well, you know, we have a very diverse campus, but, you know, what's the point of saying that if you're not giving those students any resources that they need to learn about their own culture, their own histories, and really uplift them in that way. Otherwise, you're just like feeding them this majoritarian narrative and like shoving it down their throats, but still using them and, you know, their status as students of color to like make your district sound good or make your school sound good and like up their status. And I mean, really, I think it's important. I think it's a great step that Edison has taken. We've like gotten like a huge like influx of ethnic and gender studies classes this year. It's just unfortunate that other schools don't get to have that same experience, or that there's not enough funding for those classes yet, or that they're very like underdeveloped still. I think it's, you know, That's very telling of the district and the schools. But yeah, I think it's an experience that not only like diverse schools should have, but also schools that you know, that have a majority of like white students, because they also need to be given those opportunities to learn that history and expand their own knowledge. If ethnic studies could be part of like our A through G requirements, that would be amazing too, because I think it's very important for all students to understand that, whether it's their own history or just understanding the different struggles of like other marginalized groups. I think is important and really builds a lot of character.
Oh, I think he's on mute. Oh, you ready for that?
Oh, yeah. So just a little reminder. Just this is a little something I learned from Dr. Jose Cintrón. When we're in the classroom and we're making decisions, these decisions are political decisions, right? Whether you choose to just leave it as is, or you choose to supplement a lot of these things with outside resources, that's a choice that you make. And teaching is political. There's no way outside of it. And so we gotta jump into that and do these classes, or do your class, teach your classes with intent. And that's it.
All right. Thank you so much, Lauren and Fernando. And thank you very much, Dr. Brunson and Dr. DeWalt, for all of these powerful ideas. We are going to be transitioning now into our Q&A session. And so if folks have any lingering thoughts, questions, ideas in their minds that you have not had a chance to share in the, off camera, in the Q&A or in the chat, please go ahead and do that now. And if it's okay with you, Dr. Lopez, would you mind opening up our Q&A by offering a question to our participants?
Sure, thank you so much. Oh, there I go, I'm unmuted. All right, so here's one of the questions we got. What are the difficulties of adopting anti-racist pedagogies in your district? And we have a similar one, so I'm going to ask both of them if that's okay. How can educators also push for implementing race and social justice and/or ethnic studies courses? So difficulties adopting and getting anti-racist pedagogies and courses, and then what can educators do?
I think like every class can be infused with some of these things here, but I think a large part of the challenge is we've been socialized too, right? And we went through the same school system too. So a lot of it is like doing some reprogramming ourselves, right? To be ready for this stuff in the classroom, for sure. As far as the part about implementing or getting like a class like a race and social justice or ethnic studies in your school district, I believe the race and social justice class that's at Fresno Unified was a movement that was started by the students. But I would say like the way a race and social justice and US history class is taught, you can still teach a regular US history class in the same way. And I would argue that you should teach it in the same way. As far as the ethnic studies stuff, this is a movement across the state. There is various groups organizing to push their districts to get ethnic studies. And right now there's movement at the state. So I feel like some districts are a little bit more willing to listen and to entertain this idea because it's coming down the line. Hit us up. We could put some information down if you're interested. We're always wanting to talk to people about expanding ethnic studies for sure.
I'll add on to the difficulties. I think for our school site, that's how we started it. We started on a micro level. So Fernando and I both wrote the curriculum and the course proposals. And at that time, I want to be very specific about this. At that time, we had very supportive administrators who went through the process with us, encouraged us to write the curriculum and to get these classes. Now, in terms of the difficulties going forward, any change of administration is going to lead to a change of how you're treated and how your classes are treated and stuff like that. So I can say for myself, in the 3 years that I've been teaching this class, I probably have had one administrator walk into my classroom in the 3 years since that I've been teaching that class that has seen what these students have been doing. So it is difficult because you do feel isolated. I think that's the biggest thing, like isolation, especially if you're the only person at your school doing this type of work. Within the district setting, I think the biggest difficulty is getting district administrators to understand what the purpose of ethnic studies is and what the purpose of ethnic studies is not. So it's kind of teaching people that are in leadership roles what you're trying to accomplish with students. And even having students then push, I think that's how you really get your district to listen, is to inform students of what these classes are. So if you have student cultural groups on your campus, go to them and explain, hey, at lunchtime, of course, go to them and explain, what are these classes? What do they offer? Are you interested in something like that? And if your school board can refuse a student, then that says more, like there's way more work that needs to be done on organizing level. Also reaching out to community nonprofits and people that are about student advocacy already and aligning with them to help you push your work, because we know that these districts can target teachers like that, but they can't target a community. So once you're able to like build that real community relationship, then you're able to push that work forward. So hopefully that answered the question, I think.
Thank you both. And we'll share towards the end, our next teach-in will actually be bringing in educators from different districts who are teaching these courses, so we can continue that conversation. Do you want to ask the next one, Dr. Arguleta?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Lopez. So we want to make sure we're bringing in our first presenters, Dr. DeWalt and Dr. Brunson, into the conversation as well. So this is kind of one that's open to all four of you. A common claim that is raised by certain folks is that teaching about histories of racialization, anti-Blackness, and the oppression of marginalized groups is, quote, anti-American and, quote, unpatriotic. Can any of our panelists offer some of the ways that you personally respond to this claim?
I'm still trying to process the question in a way. I'm thinking about how I taught when I was a first grade teacher 3 years ago. Some of what we're talking about now wasn't in my thought process, and so I have to admit that. So some of the things that we're talking about in terms of anti-racism and things like that, I wasn't, as a first year, second year teacher. One of the things that I did, going back to the thing, I'm from Houston. So when you talked about Houston, I was like, okay, my ears perked up a little bit more. And so one of the things that I remember is not realizing how important language was for my students. And I would correct them as first graders, correcting language. And in doing so, I didn't realize until I became a graduate student how harmful that was. And so part of what I would say is, one of the things that I think all of us have talked about in our own way is, you don't know what you don't know. And so part of the challenge is that we have to continuously educate ourselves and strategize, because the reality is that most of the things that we're talking about aren't, we have to change the narrative. We have to change the narrative. And part of changing the narrative is through I look at it this way: you have to treat it like chess. You have to anticipate the next move, the third move, the fourth move, the fifth move, and you also have to document. You have to provide your resources. You need to, I tell my students that if you're gonna do these type of things, you need to have, when my students get to that point, I'm telling them that you need to have these things. You need to have evidence for why you're doing what you do in terms of the literature, in terms of your resources. And you do need to tie it to what they expect as well, because you're fusing those two. And so going back to what our last group talked about, they're synthesizing what's required with what's also needed, what's also lacking. And I think that's going to be, that's part of what you're going to have to do, is because if you have a weak administrator, it's going to be tough to do anything. It's just going to be tough. I was fortunate to be with a very strong administrator. I was fortunate to be with a young administrator who was growing into the role, but they were two different dynamics in terms of what type of support, what type of help, what type of things we were able to do in those spaces that would fit into what your question was about what is viewed as right or wrong, what is viewed as aligned with what's aligned with what is expected, what is normative. But a lot of what is expected and what's normative is the real problem. So it's white supremacists. So when we talk about these things, is the reality is you are making people nervous. And you got to figure out, understand that you're being an advocate. And being an advocate, I'll just say it like my colleague says it. When you recognize these things, are you willing to lose some skin? Are you willing to lose it? Because if your students, now again, you have to be strategic, because your students need you there. So I'm not saying talk yourself out of that position, but I'm saying you have to be strategic. I call it being an insurgent. You have to have one foot in, one foot out. You have to be able to navigate. If you are non-white, you're already operating in a binary. You're already doing it. And if you're multiracial, you're operating in it's multifaceted. Is leveraging that ability in this academic space intentionally. And I'm gonna stop there.
I would just add to that, one of the things I appreciate about Lauren's comments is that she emphasized the significance of student activism for bringing about change in school curriculum. And that when I think about the history of ethnic studies becoming a discipline, of women's gender and sexuality studies becoming its own discipline, that this emerged out of student activist struggles to have themselves represented in the classroom, right? And that you had students who identified as Americans calling out the ways in which our curricula had been whitewashed, right, in order to uphold a particular narrative about who was American, about who merited particular rights, and about who was valued within our societies. And so absolutely, our fields have always been pushing back against that. I suppose you could argue that that activism is patriotic if that is a person's mission, right? There also is so much evidence that also demonstrates how it benefits students of all racial groups to learn about these histories. So in school districts where you've incorporated ethnic studies, African-American studies, Chicanic studies, and so forth, women's studies, that student learning outcomes have improved, that graduation rates have improved. And so there's just so much benefit to what we're talking about to bring this into the classroom that I think helps to counter these assumptions that talking about non-white populations, about women, LGBTQ populations, and so forth is somehow less American than the traditional narrative.
Thank you for that, Dr. Brunson, Dr. DeWalt. The next question is for our teachers, so Lauren and Fernando. What kinds of experiences within your preparation process would have been important, if you can think back, to prepare you to do the work that you're doing now, that you aspire to do?
Now, we actually compare our experiences pretty often. I went to Sac State and she went to Fresno State, right? Some of the things that were extremely impactful for me at Sac State is my professors were activists too. So they weren't just talking the talk, they were walking the walk. That was something that made it, I wasn't into activism at all when I went into Sac State. And so that made it really changed the way I saw the role of a teacher, as far as engaging with the community, because they were doing it themselves. The other thing is we had some serious talks about, real talks about systemic racism, about systems of oppression. as part of our credential program, right? And those were some of the lessons that really shaped and molded and kind of gave me certain intentions when I started teaching, for sure.
Yeah, we compare our situations a lot. I know this is a Fresno State platform, but I went to school a long time ago, so I don't think it's the same way because you have amazing educators. And I always tell Dr. Lopez this, like, I did not get this opportunity. I don't even think the word anti-racist was used throughout my credentialing process. I don't believe that there were, and if racism was used, it was more in the context of like how to avoid to get firing, or like what school districts do you go to if you like are a racist, right? So in terms of like teacher preparation, I would say some of the things that I wish I had when I was going through my teacher programs were really focusing on, one, like in these school districts, who are the students that you're serving, and having a class that covers what are their communities like, what are their experiences like. Because when you step into a classroom, you really are there, like, and I know if there's credentialed or teacher, student teachers here, sorry, I couldn't think of the word, student teachers here, then you are in the classroom alone, and then you're the complete authority. There's no professor with you, there's no admin with you, it's just you. So I wish I'd known when I was looking at the students of 36 students in one period, like, whoa, what is happening here? Like, what are the dynamics that are shaping this classroom is step one. I would also say, I don't know if this is possible or somebody's working on this, but I think being a teacher of color, I think being a Black woman who's a teacher, I have a totally different experience in a process than other teachers have, because I've dealt with racist admin, I've dealt with racist children, right? So how do I prepare myself not to face teacher burnout is a totally different conversation. I don't know if there can be affinity spaces in credentialing programs. I don't know if we should all share the same space and say, hey, these are what teachers of color, your coworkers, are going to be going through. So how we have conversations about like connect with a veteran teacher, but also like maybe we should have conversations of like connect with a teacher of color. What is it like for teachers of color when you're the Black teacher and they come to you for the Black issues, right, on your campus? Or you're the Mexican teacher and it's, hey, can you talk to this student about A, B, C, and D? So I think those are some of the clear things that need to be discussed in credentialing. Maybe that's a pathway forward. Maybe it's introducing your students to a book of teachers of color. I don't know how that looks, but that's what I would say that I would have found useful is like, how do you prepare me, who I am as a full person, to step into a classroom?
Great. Thank you all very much for those detailed and impassioned answers. I think we need to see that, right, in our educators. We're going to open it up again to all four of our presenters. This is a pair of questions because in different ways, right, excuse me, we all continue to think about ourselves as teachers, and we all continue to think about ourselves as students. So from Facebook, how should the students respond to racism, such as in the video shown by Fernando and Lauren's presentation? And then from Zoom, as a new teacher, how should we handle instances of racist educators? How can we push back and not become one ourselves?
I'll start because I feel like, whoa. So I want to say the littlest part of it because that's a whoa situation. I think distance learning has exposed a lot. I'll say that. I think that parents are now hearing what these teachers are saying, which exposes a lot. So I feel like for distance learning, how can you not become one of those teachers is, like Fernando said, to become educated yourself, to unsocialize what you have learned and what you have assumed about your students, what you have assumed about their communities and their lived experiences. I also, and I love social justice, like I care deeply about the Breonna Taylor situation. I don't invite conversations with my students that I'm not prepared to discuss, period. Like I don't have those conversations. And I tell students the reason why. Hey, I'm not prepared to discuss this right now because I'm not informed. or I'm not prepared to discuss this because tensions are high right now, right? So that's where I leave it. I'm honest with my students. I don't try to engage in a conversation that I'm not ready for. And that's modeling to students that, hey, you shouldn't engage in a conversation that you're not ready for, because you say one thing that is racist, that is then what you become, especially in the setting that we're in. So I think for me, if I was a new teacher, really don't engage in conversations where you have a lack of knowledge. So you can't just step into the role of becoming an anti-racist educator without preparing yourself for that role. So that's what I would say for
that. One of the things that I was thinking about, I think I commented on that question in the chat, but my first thing for the new teacher at the school, I definitely would want to know more about the administration there, because that's kind of set the tone for how I respond. If you have strong leadership, I would reach out to them and see, are they responsive? Are they receptive? Are they proactive? What type of leadership you have? I would look there. I also would think about the union. If you're part of the union, reach out to them in terms of that. But I also would then start looking, depending if you are, what type of grade level you work with. This is someone within your grade level or someone above, it would depend. But those would be the first two avenues I would take, because I would take an avenue that would take the responsibility. I would say, as a new teacher, I would not want you to advise you to put yourself in that way just yet. That I would first go to administration and see what administration offers. I would look at union, and if those things are there, then you would need to make a decision about how you want to. I'm not saying be silent. I'm saying be strategic. Okay. From my perspective, these type of conversations, these type of circumstances, in this type of climate, in a conservative space that Fresno is, I will be strategic. And this is where strong leadership comes in. If you have weak leadership, then this is a whole different conversation. Then you have to make some hard choice decisions. Again, it comes back to, what are you willing to do for the benefit of your students? And that's just a hard question that you have to ask. But my first things would be, look at administration, go to your union, try to leverage those two things first. And if those things are not available, then you need to make a decision of how you want to respond. I would try to respond in a civil way, professional way. But I also would address some of the concerns that you have with support, with evidence, with something there, so that way someone's not saying you're just making this up. Have some things there. So this happened. These are things that are happening. So that way, at least you are not. One of the things I always worry about when we start talking about issues of race is we quickly blame the victim or the person who's asking the question or pointing it out, because it becomes emotional, it becomes other things. So take it back to where it matters. Take it back to evidence, having some evidence that supports why you're asking these questions, you're addressing these things. And I would take that to your administration too. I hope that helps.
I totally agree with everything that Dr. DeWalt said. And then just in addition to that, find some allies. You got to find some allies on campus, and you got to have them. You got to know who they are, right? I'm always watching, always listening for whatever comments are made, and then I'll talk to people, and then you just got to know who your allies are. And then the other part, it may or may not make a difference, but if it's appropriate, file that complaint. File that complaint is gonna, they might not do anything, but it's gonna get placed on the file and it's gonna get documented, right? And I just say, just leave it there just in case. When at the appropriate time, if necessary, it'll be there.
Okay, thank you all for that. Yeah, really, really well thought out and wise guidance for us all. I know we are getting close to the end of time, so can I just maybe briefly invite, or can we briefly invite each of the participants to just share maybe one brief takeaway that you'd like to end off with, and then after that we'll pass the mic to Dr. Lopez to begin to move us toward our next steps of action.
Yeah, so I guess I would just say my takeaway is I hope that, or what works for me, I'll say, is using the tools that I'm developing in the classroom to not just change how I present content to students, but to also trouble every aspect of how I view society, right? In order to unlearn a lot of the racism, sexism, and other isms that I've internalized throughout my life. And to do so by reading widely, but also by listening to a lot of different kinds of people, including the students, and trying to be open to when they push back, because sometimes they might be calling me out on things that I'm not aware of that I'm bringing into the classroom, right? So I'll just leave it there.
I would like to say just that it's a process, right? I think Dr. DeWalt kind of touched on this, that it's growth, right? You're not going to be, or hopefully you're not the same educator in a couple of years that you are right now. And the key is to continue to get yourself informed and to do some self-criticism, right? Self-criticism and just constant reflection on your lessons and the units, the sequence of the lessons, and really what are the underlying messages that you're giving, right? As you're doing your teaching, right? What are the overt things that you're teaching to your students through your curriculum? And you just gotta be comfortable with being wrong sometimes, right? With being wrong sometimes and having to do some major corrections. Yeah, con amor, like Ashley said, definitely con amor. Self-criticism, but also be nice to yourself, for sure.
I would just say, in line with that, be patient and kind to yourself. I found that year 3 was always the breakout year. I found that as a new teacher, that 3rd year is where I felt like the world stopped spinning so fast. And then I was able to operate in it. So be patient, be kind with yourself, and also give yourself license to, this is gonna sound crazy, but it's really important for me to say, is give yourself license to be that critical thinker. You know, and so again, this goes back to what they were saying earlier. They were doing additional research. They were looking at things, they were expanding their palette. They were diversifying their ability to do things. So I would say be kind to yourself, be patient with yourself, and allow yourself to grow while you're being kind and patient.
I think for myself, my biggest takeaway would be, I think with love is honestly, it's come from community, the participants. I think that as teachers, and especially teachers of color, with what we're dealing with, the uplift that we're dealing with, I would say that focus on what you can change, because it will seem insurmountable sometimes, and that can infiltrate you personally as a human being, right? Knowing when to step in, when to take a step back, and focusing on the things that really can provide you with change, and being okay that you can't solve everything, but that you can try to make the changes and try to resist anti-Black racism and practice anti-racist ideologies in what you do in your classroom. So that's what I would say.
Thank you for that, all of you. I appreciate those words. I think the theme here, and something that from the beginning when we started these series, was to really make sure that folks know that this is a journey, right? Identity is fluid, life is constantly evolving and changing. And, you know, there's no such thing as being, just abandon the notion of being all knowing, right? That institutions are all knowing, that people are all knowing. And so I just appreciate the humility of all of our panelists, the question and dialogue. I want to quickly just show the flyer. We will be getting this out. So our next webinar will be on, or teach-in rather, will be on April 8th. We've heard a few references to the fierce Ashley Rojas, Executive Director of Varios Unidos. So we will be calling in colleagues who are working with community and with young people outside of school context, and we will be expanding and bringing in a group of educators to talk about anti-racist and anti-oppressive pedagogies, foreign of liberation. And I'm excited to be joined by my colleague, our colleague, Dr. Rohit Mehta. So please, we'll get this information out. For those who are, I know we have a number of students on here. If we can go to the next slide, please fill out the survey, all of you, just your feedback. Really the feedback we got in fall, received in fall rather, is what informed the topics that we're unpacking for this series. And then if you're a student, I know many of our students are receiving course credit. We want to honor and you know, just acknowledge the professors who are bringing this stuff into their classroom. So please fill out the survey. There will be an option to let us know if you do want the certificate of completion in that as well. I'm going to now hand it over to finish us off with Dr. Aguilera again to share some more resources. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. So just a couple of, to kind of bring things back to some of the acknowledgement that we made at the top of the session. If you're interested in continuing to be in community with our Asian American Pacific Islander activists and leaders here on campus, please follow us on Twitter, twitter.com/AFSA Fresno State. That's the Asian Faculty and Staff Association, for updates on the ways that we are trying to mobilize on campus and on the ground. We'll also link you to other organizations across the country who are doing work, because at the end of the day, right, it is the streets that we need to listen to. And so if you're interested in joining us, please follow for updates. We're also going to share, we're not going to talk through these here because there's a lot, but we plan on sharing out all of these resources to folks in a follow-up email. And so as you can see, there are ways to donate, ways to petition, ways to report, ways to take care of your own mental health. I mean, stuff that we really, really have to take seriously. And so please be on the lookout for these and other resources. We really want to stress the fact that this is not an individual struggle, right? This is work that we need to do collectively. And so think about all of these different resources that we're going to share for support, and all of these different resources that think about our role in relationship to one another, right? As families, as caregivers. Thank you for that. Let's bring it on home.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to all who are listening in from Facebook Live as well. We appreciate you being here. Have a restful evening.